We can cooperate flexibly with countless numbers of strangers because we alone, of all the animals on the planet, can create and believe fictional stories. And as long as everybody believes in the same fiction, everybody obeys and follows the same rules, the same norms, the same values. Most legal systems today in the world are based on a belief in human rights. But what are human rights? Human rights, just like God and heaven, are just a story that we've invented. They are not an objective reality. They are not some biological fact about Homo sapiens. Take a human being, cut him open, look inside, you will find the heart, the kidneys, neurons, hormones, DNA, but you won't find any rights. The only place you find rights is in the stories that we have invented and spread around over the last few centuries. They may be very positive stories, very good stories, but they are still just fictional stories that we've invented.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I believe these words represent one of the most significant ideas that humans have ever concocted. Prior to the invention of rights, most humans lived lives of involuntary servitude. Whether it was under the rule of a king, a pharaoh, or a pope, most humans had no protections from the predations of those in power. This was the state of the world going back thousands of years. The idea that there should be restrictions on what those in power are permitted to do represents a drastic change from that status quo. Following the birth of the United States of America in 1776, humanity has experienced the greatest expansion of personal freedoms in recorded history. During the last 200 years, slavery, a once universal practice, was virtually abolished. Women were given the right to vote. Minorities were granted legal protections. Free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, due process, and the right to a trial by jury are epitomes of individual liberty that most people who live in a free society now take for granted. That's not to imply that this process has been perfect. There are, of course, many examples in this period of people having their rights violated. The overall trend, however, has been the expansion of the universal part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This expansion has got us to the point where people living in free societies today enjoy nearly unlimited freedom when compared to most people throughout history. This development was, in my opinion, exceedingly positive. Despite all the progress we have made as a species, there are worrying indications that this trend might have reached an inflection point. A report authored by Freedom House titled Freedom in the World 2020 found that we are in the 14th consecutive year of a global recession in democracy. According to Freedom House President Mike Arbamowitz, almost twice as many countries declined in their scores this year as improved, and those declines aren't just happening in places you'd expect like China or Russia, but also in established democracies. How do we explain this decline? As Yuval Noah Harari explained in his TED Talk, human rights are a story we tell ourselves about how society should function. The story only holds if enough people believe in it. Absent that belief, and all the wonderful freedoms that we have been blessed with vanish like a fart in the wind. When humans become accustomed to something, they tend to start taking it for granted. In taking our rights for granted, I fear that we may lose sight of how fragile they really are. Our rights are what guarantee our freedom, but they come at a cost. Buying into this story requires that you accept that everyone else has rights as well. For you to have freedom of speech, you are required to accept that other people will say things you don't like. For you to have freedom of religion, you are required to accept that other people will believe in things you don't like. For you to have the right to a trial by an impartial jury, you are required to accept that people who have wronged you will be granted the same. In other words, if you are in favor of human rights, you must be in favor of them for everyone, even the people you hate the most. This brings me to the topic of today's video, the trial of Derek Chauvin. As you probably know by now, Chauvin was convicted on all counts for the murder of George Floyd. Much has been said about this verdict, and I don't believe that I have anything meaningful to add to this point. What I'm going to focus on instead is the jury itself. Specifically, I'm going to focus on the social pressure they were facing leading up to their deliberation and why I believe that pressure may have tainted their verdict. Already in the pre-trial hearings, there were strong indications that the jurors' safety was under threat. Aside from the riots that have been ongoing since the death of George Floyd, the defendants and their attorneys were verbally and physically harassed by a mob after the hearing on September 11th. A member of the defense counsel had his truck vandalized. The court also received numerous unpleasant messages, some outright threatening, demanding that a certain outcome be assured, often against the defendants. To protect the jurors from this kind of intimidation, the judge ruled that the jury was to remain anonymous. This potential danger was, of course, obvious to the jurors themselves. During the jury selection process, many of the potential jurors expressed fear regarding their participation in the trial. As reported by the New York Times, to a person, nearly all of the jurors expressed fear, surprise, and trepidation about playing a role in a case that has opened deep racial wounds in the city and sitting on a trial that will be televised around the world, a first for Minnesota. Robert Barnes, one of the most accomplished lawyers in America, tweeted the following: "Anyone who doubts cancel culture and its corollary methods of intimidation, including defamation, doxing, and rioting, should watch the jury selection in the #Chauvin trial. Juror after juror admits fear an acquittal will put them in personal danger." In the following article, the Associated Press reported that one prospective juror's voice quivered as she told attorneys during jury selection that she feared for her family's safety if chosen for the panel that will decide the fate of a white former police officer charged with killing George Floyd. When the judge excused her, the woman exhaled in relief. A looming question is whether Chauvin, charged with murder and manslaughter, can get a fair trial with so much pressure on jurors, and with some potentially fearing the consequences to the city and country should they reach a verdict others oppose. A high fence installed around the courthouse for the trial is a daily reminder for the jurors of security concerns. On some days, protesters gathered just beyond it, holding signs that read, "Convict Derek Chauvin," and "The world is watching." In addition to second-hand reporting, we can listen to what the jurors said themselves. The trial was live-streamed, and the recordings are all available on YouTube. Here are a few excerpts from the selection process.
When you obviously had heard about this case before filling out this questionnaire.
Correct.
When you got the questionnaire, however, and you learned you were a potential juror in this case, how did that make you feel?
Very nervous.
Why?
The possibility of I'm a very shy person anyway, so it just is a little difficult
Okay.
for me to, and I didn't want to be on this case, so.
Okay. Why didn't you want to be on this case?
I fear for the safety of my family.
You were asked a question, do you believe your community has been negatively or positively affected by any of the events that have taken place in the Twin Cities area since Mr. Floyd's death? And you wrote negatively.
Yes.
Why do you think that?
Because now everybody's running out to Home Depot and Menards and buying security cameras, and even we had a shooting in our alley a month ago where somebody drove by and shot through the garage, someone's garage, so it's concerning.
So it's like the uptick in crime?
Yes, and the whole defund the police thing to me is lunacy.
Okay. And you live in the Minneapolis proper, right?
South Minneapolis.
Okay. Now, there's a difference, obviously, between, or would you agree that there is a difference between protesting and rioting?
Yes.
And how would you define the difference between protesting and rioting?
I think Martin Luther King and the protests back then were peaceful. That's a protest. A riot is not a protest. Burning buildings down is not a protest. Taking someone's livelihood away is not a protest.
Can you tell us why you weren't sure?
It's more from a safety security standpoint. As far as I'm concerned, I feel comfortable and safe, but I just wouldn't want any any issues or harm to come to my wife or my family. If certain individuals that were out to intimidate or cause harm. I mean, if they knew where I lived, I mean, it's potential they could, do damage to the house or spray paint the house or garage door or break a window.
After the jury had been selected and the trial itself began, the fear expressed during the selection process was proven to be justified, as there were multiple attempts made at doxing the jurors. In March, a woman was caught taking photographs inside of the courtroom, an action which is prohibited because it obviously risks exposing the jurors' identities. The photos were deleted on the judge's orders. In April, multiple media outlets, including the Star Tribune and the New York Times, published articles containing the personal details of all the jurors, everything short of their names and home addresses. This strikes me as particularly egregious, because this amount of information virtually guarantees that the jurors' personal identities will be discovered. If you are skeptical about that claim, I invite you to check out the video Capture the Flag, He Will Not Divide Us, from the channel Internet Historian. A summary of the story is as follows. Actor Shia LaBeouf hangs up a flag in the middle of nowhere and broadcasts it on a 24/7 live stream. There were no landmarks, no scenery, seemingly no clues at all as to the flag's location. Despite having virtually no information to go on, except that it was somewhere in the United States, the flag was found and taken down. How did the internet manage such a task? The process was truly remarkable. Here are just some of the steps that were taken in pursuit of this goal.
Because it was a live stream, they could match the time of sunset to quickly discern that the flag was somewhere in the Eastern time zone.
That's 2/3 of the country ruled out in one move. Others began looking into intel about Shia's whereabouts, as it was highly likely that he was present for the raising of the flag itself. As time went on, distinct noises could be heard in the background, the croaking of frogs, suggesting water nearby.
The point I'm trying to hammer home is that people can uncover amazing things through the internet and decentralized cooperation. Given the amount of information published by the legacy media, it seems unreasonable to me to assume that a group of dedicated individuals would be unable to discover the jurors' identities. This leads us to the following question. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that the jurors had reached a different verdict and that their identities were discovered. What would happen to them in that case? While we can't know for sure, I believe that we can get a good idea by examining what has happened to others who have crossed the mob. Exhibit 1. Severed pig's head is left outside former home of Chauvin defense witness who said George Floyd's death was accidental. Vandals struck early on Saturday at Barry Broad's former home in Santa Rosa, California. They smeared animal blood all over the door and garage and left a severed pig's head on the stoop. Broad has not lived there for several years, but it appears he was the target, after he testified for the defense in Derek Chauvin's trial in Minnesota. Broad claimed police were justified in pinning George Floyd while handcuffed. The important thing to note here is that the intended target, Barry Broad, was a witness brought by the defense. Exhibit 2. On April 11th, as the case was ongoing, Dante Wright was shot and killed by a police officer roughly 10 miles from the spot where George Floyd died. The Daily Mail reports, Dante Wright had a warrant for his arrest when he was killed and appeared in court for attempted aggravated robbery charges after choking and holding a woman at gunpoint for $820 in 2019, court papers reveal. Dante Wright was shot dead by Brooklyn Center police officer Kimberly Potter Sunday after he was pulled over for expired license plate tags. DailyMail.com can reveal Wright, 20, had a warrant out for his arrest at the time related to misdemeanor firearm offenses. He had previously been arrested for attempted aggravated robbery charges. Charging papers allege Wright and a second man attended a party in December 2019 at the home of two women in Minnesota. The women allowed the pair to crash after they said they didn't have a ride home. The next morning, after one of the women went to withdraw $820 in rent money, Wright allegedly held her at gunpoint and demanded she give him the cash. His bail was originally set at $100,000 with orders that he should not contact the victim or any witnesses, refrain from drugs and alcohol, and not have any weapon. It was revoked in July last year due to his failure to not possess a firearm or ammunition, and not keeping in touch with his probation officer. He missed a court appearance on April 2nd, and a warrant was issued for his arrest, which was the one that appeared on a police search before he was shot dead. The police released the body cam footage from the incident. We can see that as Wright is being arrested, he resists the arrest and attempts to flee. The cop in question indicates that she is going to tase him, but shoots him instead. This is, of course, a tragic incident that I believe demonstrates the need for better police training. Had this cop been better trained, she may not have mistakenly drawn her gun in this situation, which is what seems to be the case. To the mob, however, none of these details matter. A white cop shot a black man. The circumstances are utterly irrelevant. Case in point.
It feels like we're in a war zone.
It feels like they're in a war zone, that person said. Minnesota's governor has deployed the National Guard after Black Lives Matter protesters hit the streets in his states following the death of a black man in an officer-involved shooting. As you know, tensions are already sky high with the Derek Chauvin murder trial entering its third week in Minneapolis.
We've been able to survey some of the damage across town here, and this is just one of many businesses that were smashed in, looted, or destroyed. This is a GameStop, and just next door is a UPS store that was also heavily looted. And we, a short while ago, spoke to the sister of the owner of that smashed-in UPS store.
They destroyed everything. They pulled it out. It's not about stealing. I think it's just they wanted to break in and just destroy it. You know, it's nothing to steal here in UPS. What do? They purposely want to destroy it. That's sad, you know.
And we also, not long ago, saw National Guard and police officers in tactical gear protecting the police precinct here that was targeted last night. Bullets reportedly went through that building. And the Minnesota Public Safety Commissioner says the National Guard has rapidly moved into phase 3 here, increasing their deployment in Minneapolis and in the town of Brooklyn Center. The Guard has already been stationed outside of the courthouse in downtown Minneapolis, where the Derek Chauvin murder trial is ongoing right now.
The rioting got so bad that the National Guard was called in and a 7 p.m. curfew was implemented. This was, however, not enough to stop the rioting, which went on for days. Also, we have this story from the New York Post. Daunte Wright shooting. Brooklyn Center city manager fired after the call for due process for police officer. The story is that the city manager stated that the officer responsible for the shooting should be given due process. All employees working for the City of Brooklyn Center are entitled to due process with respect to discipline, Bogney said. This employee will receive due process, and that's really all that I can say today. This resulted in his firing because the Brooklyn City Center Council voted to fire Bogney, a longtime city employee, during an emergency meeting, the Star Tribune reported. During a virtual workshop after the meeting, Council member Chris Lawrence Anderson said she voted to fire Bogney out of fear of potential reprisals from protesters if she did not. He was doing a great job. I respect him dearly, Lawrence Anderson said. I didn't want repercussions at a personal level. A person who called for the rule of law to be upheld was fired because his co-workers feared personally being attacked by the mob. What effect do you imagine this might have had on the jurors? Significant rioting took place in Brooklyn Center, and it was revealed in the court on the following Monday that at least one of the jurors lived there, and that some of the other jurors had to travel through that area in order to reach the courthouse. Reuters reports the impact this had on the jury. The magnitude of the case and possibility that a not guilty verdict could trigger renewed civil unrest is evident in downtown Minneapolis, where the tower in which the courtroom sits is ringed by barbed wire and watched over by some 3,000 troops activated by the state's National Guard. During questioning by lawyers from both sides, several potential jurors noted the besieged appearance of the city. Nearby businesses have boarded up their windows. Demonstrations on the street outside can be heard in the courtroom. Exhibit 3.
I wish elected officials would stop talking about this case, especially in a manner that is disrespectful to the rule of law and to the judicial branch in our function.
We even had politicians getting involved. This is Congresswoman Maxine Waters. She traveled to Minnesota under police escort and violated the curfew in order to address the mob. This is what she had to say.
I am very hopeful, and I hope that we're going to get a verdict that is say guilty, guilty, guilty. And if we don't, we cannot go away.
And not just manslaughter, right? I mean...
Oh, no, not manslaughter. No. This is guilty for murder. I don't know whether it's in the first degree, but as far as I'm concerned, it's first degree.
Congresswoman, what happens if we do not get what you just told? What should the people do? What should protesters on the street do?
I didn't hear you.
What happens?
What should protesters do?
Well, we got to stay on the street, and we've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business.
Her statements suggest to me that she does not care at all about the rule of law. Before the jurors had begun deliberating, she was calling for Chauvin to be found guilty. She then called for the mob to become more confrontational if their demands were not met. To give you an inkling of what more confrontational entails, let's take a look at what the current level of confrontation looks like.
Report and do our thing.
With all this in mind, I must admit that if any of the jurors did not feel any fear when entering their deliberations, then they are braver humans than I am. Personally, I do not see how anyone can discount the possibility that these events tainted their verdict. This is relevant because the Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution guarantees the right to an impartial jury. According to the Tuskegee Institute, a total of 4,733 people were lynched in the U.S. between 1882 and 1959. 3,446 were black, and 1,297 were white. It is estimated that approximately 1/3 of the victims were falsely accused. Every single one of these incidents represents a tragedy, a gross miscarriage of justice, including the incidents where the victims were guilty of a crime. They also represent what happens in a society when the rule of law and individual rights are not upheld. The mob rules. And when the mob rules, chances are most of us will suffer as a result. I'm going to conclude this video with a quote from the book Just Mercy, which was authored by the lawyer Brian Stensvin. It is my hope that we, as a society, can turn back from the brink if we take his words to heart. Proximity has taught me some basic and humbling truths, including this vital lesson. Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I've come to believe that the true measure of our commitment to justice, the character of our society, our commitment to the rule of law, fairness, and equality cannot be measured by how we treat the rich, the powerful, the privileged, and the respected among us. The true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. We are all implicated when we allow other people to be mistreated. An absence of compassion can corrupt the decency of a community, a state, a nation. Fear and anger can make us vindictive and abusive, unjust and unfair, until we all suffer from the absence of mercy, and we condemn ourselves as much as we victimize others.